Welcome to the Checkered Floor Garage. This is the Kawasaki Vulcan 750 Maintenance and Service Series, and today we're going to be lubing the splines of your final drive and your drive shaft. According to the service manual, you'll want to lube your drive shaft every 12,000 miles. Notice how no interval for years is given. So what I'll say is that if you haven't done your drive shaft lubrication on your Vulcan, and if you don't know if the previous owner has done it, take care of this as soon as possible. For the lube, we'll be using this Loctite LB8012, and the moly content, sometimes the lube is just called moly, it's 65% molybdenum. I've got some scrap wood underneath where the center stand will go. Just to raise up the bike that much more, it'll make taking the rear tire off a lot easier. However, it'll make getting the bike up on the center stand a little bit harder. Okay, I got it, and the little life pro tip that I'll share there to make it easier, I put all of my weight on this part of the center kickstand. So with that backwards momentum, I'm out of breath, I just stood up on the center kickstand. Hopefully that makes it easy for you. Here's what that looks like, and that extra space right here between the floor and the tire will help us out a lot in a little bit. This write-up and pictures, which I'll link in the description below, comes from a Vulcan forum whose name is Fergie. To set yourself up for success for this job, it's a great idea to use a ratchet strap and tie it between the center stand and the front forks to keep the bike from rolling forward and off the center stand when we're loosening the axle nut in the back. I don't have any ratchet straps handy at the moment, unfortunately, but what I'll use is one of these quick grips, these vice grips, to clamp down on the front brake there and hold the bike in place. You just want the bike nice and secure, that way it doesn't go anywhere, and like I said, roll off the center stand. Next, let's get the license plate off to make it easier for the rear wheel to get removed. Remove this cotter pin here holding the brake drum torque rod nut, and then we're going to use a 14 mil wrench or ratchet wrench, and we're going to remove this brake rod adjusting nut. Before we do, I've marked this with some red marker. That way, when we reassemble, I know roughly where this brake adjustment nut should be. Remove both lower shock mount bolts here with a 17 mil socket or a wrench. And when we do so, we're gonna let the shock hang from the top bolts. We may have to put our foot or leg underneath the tire to support the tire as we remove the shocks from their mounts. The correct order for reassembly later on will be big washer, and then this little washer, and then the nut. We'll do that later. So I wanted to show in more detail, here's what's meant by supporting the tire, because as we take out the rear shock, the other side shock will be a little bit harder to take off because of the tire wanting to fall down. So hold the tire up, take the shocks out, and then let the tire hang down. But what I'm going to do is actually also remove the top bolt here from the shock, because I'll be making another video to re-oil these shocks according to the Climber service manual. Specific to my bike with the straight pipes, you can see the exhaust pipe, the tailpipe is actually in the way of this final drive housing. So I'm going to go ahead and remove my left side exhaust. With my exhaust pipe on the left side out of the way, you can see that the tire came all the way down and is touching the ground. So advice for you, before you remove your shocks, take a look to see if you have any aftermarket exhaust or any other accessories that would get in the way of the rear tire coming all the way down. Remove the cotter pin that holds this axle nut on. Now we're going to use a 27 mil socket and a breaker bar to remove this axle nut here. As you're doing so, just be careful again to not lurch the bike off of the center stand. For reassembly purposes, just note that the washer goes onto the motorcycle first, and then this axle nut, and then the cotter pin. Now's a good time to go ahead and remove this drum brake lever here off of this rod. I'm going to set aside this spring here in a safe spot so we don't lose it. And then we're also going to take off this nut, which I forgot earlier. Do so with a 14 mil wrench. And then next, you can tap on this axle with the plastic piece of a screwdriver, a piece of wood and a hammer. I'm gonna use a mallet and we're just gonna hit it out. Here's the axle nut that we'll remove, and then just take note of this spacer for reinstallation. It's gonna go in between the hub of the rear wheel and this part of the frame. Go ahead and grab the axle and pull it through. That was the spacer that fell out. It's already nicely lubed up from the last time I did this. We're gonna set that aside. From the rear, we're gonna grab the tire and we're gonna rock it a little bit and we're gonna tap it to the right side to get it off. And all the while, just try to have a hand on the final drive so it doesn't come smacking down to the ground. There we go. And there we go. This is a great opportunity to inspect the brake pads, the drum brakes in the back. So pull this piece straight out like that, and it should come out straightforwardly. I've got plenty of brake pad life left, so I'm not going to be replacing them today. When I do, I will make another video about it. And I'm also going to use this opportunity to go ahead and clean up out here with some brake clean. We're not doing a full detailing here. I just wanted to get the built up brake dust and everything else, all that crud washed away. That's what my rear drum brakes look like. Having this jack stand here holding up the final drive, I don't think is necessary. I just did it for the purposes of the video, just FYI. One thing to note, this comes from Fergie's write-up about the spline loop procedure. One 750 owner had this large ring clip, this circular ring clip right there, come loose. So just make sure that when you're taking the pieces off, nothing comes loose. Here's the side of the rear tire with these 7 holes. The ring clip goes inside here. So as long as nothing came out and fell onto your garage floor when you were taking off your rear wheel, you should be good. These 4 nuts here hold the final drive to the swing arm and drive shaft housing. We're gonna remove those 4 nuts with a 12mm wrench, or 12mm socket. All right, with the 4 nuts removed, let's go ahead and remove the final drive from the shaft housing. It should just pull straight out. Again, you just want to be careful with not lurching the motorcycle. There we go. Here's the final drive off of the motorcycle. You notice it's facing the right side up. I'm going to turn this around. The reason why I like to keep it right side up is because right there is the little vent hole for your final drive oil that is inside of here. I've got another YouTube video detailing how to change the final drive oil. I want to keep this little hole at the top so none of the oil spills out of this little vent hole. Also take note of this little cylindrical piece that goes inside there in the final drive. I'm just going to set it aside so we don't lose it or forget about it. So here's another closer look at my splines. They don't look to be the most lubricated. Like I said, I did do this 13,000 miles ago. I didn't really do too much cleaning before showing this on video, so that's just how my splines look after 13,000 miles of riding. And like I said, very important service item to do for a shaft-driven motorcycle. Also take note of the teeth inside here, inside this drive shaft coupling. This is also where you want to apply your moly, your lube, and an important piece to check out and inspect. You don't want to see a whole bunch of rust and powder and degradation inside here. Another common issue is that this gasket in here, that black circular gasket, could fail and leak out your moly and make a mess of here. So if you open it up and it's clean, like mine, you should be good to go. If you open it up and there's just a whole mess of lube penetrating past this gasket, it's also a good idea and time to replace this gasket. Next, I'm going to clean the teeth inside here of the final drive with a brush and some soapy water, paper towels, and Q-tips. And I'm going to do the same thing for the teeth inside here for the drive shaft of the Vulcan. Here's what it looks like after my cleaning. Again, we're not looking for a full detailing, just trying to get most of that moly
most of that old moly out. That way we can apply some fresh moly. Okay, now let's go ahead and lube the teeth inside the shaft on the motorcycle. And here's what it looks like after cleaning. There is a spring that goes right in there. So what I did is I just took the spring out, got some paper towel, as you saw in the time lapse, a little bit of soapy water, some Q-tips, and just cleaned in there a little bit. Get all of that old moly out. All right, now we're gonna get some new moly on. This is what the spline of the drive shaft looks like, liberally coated with moly. According to Fergie's write-up on this procedure, you want to use about 3 teaspoons of moly into the fitting inside there. Take note that the spring that I took out earlier, it is back in there. It's a little bit hard to see with all that moly, but remember to return the spring back to its housing in there. And lastly, just make sure that there's no air pockets. Here we are back at the final drive. Let's go ahead and lube the splines here as well. Here's what my splines look like, all lubed up. I used a liberal amount of moly. Next, we're going to put the final drive back onto the drive shaft housing over here. Remember that cylindrical piece that I showed you earlier? Just make sure that you got that. Put that back into the final drive housing, the casing right in there. When we put this on, you will feel a little bit of resistance. That's the spring just kind of pushing back. Push this on in. And get the 4 studs here, 1, 2, 3, 4, aligned with the holes on your housing. And then we'll use the 4 bolts to tighten it down to 17.5 foot-pounds. Okay, so that was a little bit harder than I anticipated. You'll notice my hat is off. I got hot. I had a hard time getting this final drive back onto the shaft. So what I did, what ultimately worked out for me, I took that spring out and I flipped around the spring. I don't think that makes a difference. I think the spring is unidirectional. I think what actually happened is when I took it out and took it back in, I must have gotten some really good, perfect alignment, and it went back in. So my advice for you is if you're struggling to put this back in, be careful of how much forward pressure you're putting on the motorcycle. Again, you don't want it to come off the center stand. Take this out, and try again. And if you get pressure, take it out and try it again. And if you get it right first time, maybe you can help me next time I do the final drive shaft lube. Tighten down your 4 bolts here with your 12mm socket in a crisscross pattern. Torque setting is going to be 17.5 foot-pounds for these bolts. Next, we're going to pull back this rubber boot here, covering the U-joint, and we are going to lube it up just a little bit with some white lithium grease. What I find that works best is instead of pulling it back this way, like no matter what, I really couldn't get much space here, even with some pry bars, some plastic pry bars. Pull it back this way. You can see there's a lot more space, a lot more real estate to get in there. And you can see some of that old white lithium grease that I did from the last time. I'm just going to spray some more in there. Here's a close-up of what my U-joint looks like after I sprayed it with some white lithium grease. I also sprayed a little bit of white lithium grease towards the left here. All right, now I'm gonna get this rubber boot secured on this side here, and then also back here, I'm just gonna make sure that this rubber boot kind of covers everything that it should, and it's nice and snug. I took off this Vulcan 750 side cover, and it got me a lot of room to be able to get this part of the boot, the right side, over on this, this drive shaft coupling side. So now the boot is all on and all covered. Let's move on to the next step. Before we put the rear tire on, put the rear drum brake assembly back in, just like that. We'll align it once the tire goes on the bike. And also have this miscellaneous hardware handy. The axle nut, the spacers, and the washers that we're going to be using, the components for the rear brake assembly, the levers, and as you can see here from my note, I always like to use new cotter pins for jobs. Okay, I struggled, so you don't have to. This is another hard part. You can see the hat's off again. I'm hot again. What I found that helps out a lot is, number one, use a jack stand to hold up the final drive. That way you can get the rear tire and mesh it on without having to worry about the friction against the ground. So, jack stand for the final drive. Get the tire meshed onto the gears, those inner teeth of the final drive first, with the axle nut out. Okay, once you mesh up the teeth of the tire here with the teeth of the final drive, it will stay in place. Out of breath again. Then, once you get the tire teeth and the final drive teeth meshed up, then and only then can you put in the axle rod. That's what I found that helps me out a lot. And all the while that you're doing that, I was using a mallet to hammer in the axle rod. When it got to about here, the axle rod, don't forget about the spacer. Put the spacer in, go back to the other side as you saw from the time lapse, hit the axle rod all the way through. And if that's not hard enough, all the while, you don't want the brake drum shoes piece to come off. And also, you just gotta be mindful of this piece and this piece. You don't want them to get stuck or caught anywhere, because this will attach to the top of the rear brake lever just right there, and then this will go right there. Next, slide on the spring back to its original home, right through there. And then this little piece, you see that hole in there? This will go inside there. The rod goes through, just like that. And the nut is missing. And this is the correct nut that's gonna go in place. Remember, we marked it in red, so we know how far approximately the brake nut should go in. Of course, you'll want to do the fine tuning on the road. All right, so you see the piece with the groove there? That goes forward facing, just like that. All right, so what you do here is adjust this roughly to where your mark was earlier. And like I said, test drive it on the road and adjust your rear brakes as needed. Next, we're gonna take this bolt here, along with this nut there, and I'm gonna put this through this way. Threads facing out to the right, and you're gonna tighten back the nut, and this is where you can get your little cotter pin here piece and put that back in. And lastly, washer goes on first, same washer from before. Your axle nut, screw that on. You want to tighten that to 80 foot-pounds, and then you'll get your new cotter pin and align that through the hole, you know, right there on the top. This brake drum torque rod, this nut right here, gets torqued down to 22 foot-pounds. When you install the rear shock absorbers back onto the motorcycle, take note of the washers, the order of the washers and the cap nuts for the bottom, which is different than the top. So this side faces the motorcycle. For the bottom, your shock absorber goes onto the motorcycle along with your washer, lock washer, and your cap nut. For the top side, you actually put a washer in between the motorcycle and the shock absorber. And then on the other side, 2 more washers here, your lock washer, and your cap nut. I think the first shock to get on is going to be the hardest because you got to lift up the tire and get it into place. But just make sure that the shock is properly mounted. There's no wiggle room, and it's not touching anything, especially if you've got, like I said earlier, any aftermarket accessories, saddlebags, exhaust, stuff like that. And that wraps up the spline lube process. Many thanks to the Vulcan 750 Forum member Fergie for an incredible write-up. I'll link it down in the description below. Without that write-up and pictures, I would not have been able to do this video, nor would I have been comfortable doing this process my first time 2 years ago when I first got this motorcycle. I hope this helps. Put your questions, comments down below. I'll get back to you, and have a good one.